Alan Williams, good morning, and thank you for your attendance.
Good morning. Good morning. How's everybody? Well, we changed a little bit. I was supposed to bat middle of the order, and now I'm lead off, so that's okay. It's okay. It's a pleasure to be here to see everybody today. I look forward very much to the next 3 days, the interaction, the discussion, everything that we're going to have. It's all about learning together. And regenerative agriculture is very much a journey and not a destination. So we're going to be or at least I will be talking a lot about that over the next 3 days in my presentations. There's still a ton of things that we don't know. And we're discovering more and more a lot of the things that we don't yet know, but that's what's so wonderful about this journey. So, first of all, regenerative agriculture. This is our definition within Understanding Ag and the Soil Health Academy. This is how we define it. So, regenerative agriculture is farming and ranching in synchrony with nature and the 4 ecosystem processes to repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore ecosystem functions, starting with the life beneath the soil and expanding to life above. Now, just like we have this building here, you don't start a building by putting the walls up first, or the roof up first, or the windows in first. You start by building a solid foundation. It's the same way, if we want to be successful in agriculture, we've got to start first with building a solid foundation. That's the soil beneath our feet. But unfortunately, many farmers and ranchers, and as they said, I'm what I call a recovering academic, many researchers in agriculture, we start focusing on things above the soil first. We ignore the very foundation, not intentionally most of the time, but we ignore the very foundation. Now, we accomplish this through application of the 6 principles of soil health and what we call the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those today. Now, I love this quote from Don Campbell, and it's very appropriate. Don says, if we want to make small changes, change the way we do things. But if we want to make major changes, we've got to change the way we see things. So really, this involves a transformation of the mind. It's a little slow. There we go. Well, I changed this a little bit. The slides are in there, but they won't follow exactly my presentation this morning. You'll actually have a little more. I cut it down a little bit. So just real briefly, we do a lot of ranching and farming and grass finishing in Mississippi and Alabama. But for us, this is what it's about. It's all about life, okay, and indicator species. So insects are one of our key indicator species, and I'm going to point that out in our pasture walk this week, but they're a very, very important indicator species, as are birds. So insects and birds both are critically important to us. We pay a lot of attention to them and what's happening in their populations and the species that we're observing. This is a video that I shot just a couple of weeks ago at our farm in Alabama. And this was on one of our moves, but I want you to observe all the birds and dragonflies. So what you're seeing in this video is an incredible array of birds, wood swallows, and things like that, accompanied with dragonflies. Now, we actually have more than 700 head of cattle in that video that were just moved into a new paddock, but because our forage is so high, they're almost obscured in the view. We are constantly keeping track of the new species of both insects, plants, and birds that we're observing. This is, for us, another new species that has shown up. This is almost like the field of dreams. If you build it, if you build the habitat, they will come, they will be there. And this is a swallowtail kite. These birds haven't been seen in our part of the country for several decades now. And we are the first farm in our region to see the return of the swallowtail kite. We now have more than 4 mating pairs on the farm. So we're thrilled to see these birds. They're absolutely gorgeous birds and beautiful to watch in the air, incredibly aerodynamic. We also do, beyond doing grass-fed beef, we do pastured pig production. In pigs, we move all of our livestock species daily under single strands of polywire. The pigs we love pigs. You know, they have incredible personalities, and they're an excellent tool for us in terms of soil building and land improvement. This is some of our pastured pork. We harvest our pigs typically at about 300 to 320 pounds. We market to a lot of restaurants, and they want a larger cut that has a very high degree of marbling. We also do pastured lamb production. Our breeds that we use in our sheep, most of our pigs are Gloucestershire Old Spot, and the breeds of choice that we use in our sheep, we do a Katahdin Australian White Cross. We also do extensive pastured egg production. We have about 8,000 laying hens now, working our way up to 12,000 is really where we want to be, but we've got about 8,000 on the ground right now. These are 3 visitors from Louisiana. We do routinely host tours. So these are some visitors from Louisiana. We use guardian dogs. You can see one of them there with the 3 gentlemen from Louisiana, but we have guardian dogs that we use to protect our chickens. So we don't use any electric fencing or anything like that. The guardian dogs do the work for us. They protect them from both the sharp-toothed predators, coyotes, fox, bobcat, things like that, as well as the raptors. We've got bald eagles and hawks and falcons and everything else, and we have little to no predation, either from the raptors or the sharp-toothed, because of these guardian dogs. This is some of our grass-fed beef, so we do produce very high-quality, well-marbled grass-fed beef on a routine basis. So let's dive into what we call adaptive stewardship. Adaptive stewardship. First of all, we've got to realize this. Nature will humble you. And if you refuse to be humbled, nature will defeat you. We are not smart enough. There is not an engineer alive that is smart enough or clever enough to design a structure that nature cannot utterly destroy. But yet, sometimes we think we are that smart. We need to humble ourselves and realize that instead of fighting against nature, we need to work with nature. And, I actually hear a lot of farmers and ranchers talk with pride about how they're fighting nature. And I'm beating nature. No, you're not. If you think you're beating nature, you're fooling yourself. Absolutely fooling yourself. And she will destroy you if you do not determine how to work with her. How many know who Wendell Berry is? I hope a lot of people in here raise your hands. Wendell Berry, if you don't know who Wendell Berry is, you need to know who he is. But he's written a lot of books, a lot of works, but he's in his 80s now, retired to his farm in Kentucky. But Wendell is a world-renowned farmer philosopher, and this is a 2018 New York Times op-ed where Wendell states agricultural choices must be made by these inescapable standards: the ecological health of the farm and the economic health of the farmer. And then Masanabu. Masanabu wrote One Straw Revolution. He is like the Wendell Berry of Japan. And Masanabu states that an object seen in isolation from the whole is not the real thing. This is a core mistake we have made as farmers and ranchers, and a core mistake we have made as agricultural researchers. We have tried to isolate things and do all of our research in isolation because we can't confuse or compound or bias things or confound things, right? That's what we tell ourselves as researchers. So we try to reduce the variables to as few as possible, but in the real world of farming and ranching and nature and biology, it does not work that way. And what we have done is confused ourselves. We have reached various researchers, we have reached very erroneous conclusions. And we've made very wrong extrapolations from our research because we've been making this very mistake, viewing objects in isolation from the whole. One of the things that we teach and that we work with our clients is what we call historical ecological perspective. And this is really very important. You've got to think beyond the last 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. And you've got to go back here in North America at least 500 years in most of the continent to be able to truly understand what this country was like, what this land was like prior to European incursion. Now, why is that so important? It's important because it gives us a glimpse of the unbelievable abundance that once existed here, the diversity of life, the array of life. And it also gives us a clue into what can yet be, because that diversity, that abundance is still there if we just build the habitat to attract it back. So that's why this historical ecological perspective is so important. For instance, in the South, we often think that this was this deeply, heavily wooded area from the Atlantic all the way to the Mississippi. You know, when I was in elementary school, I was taught that a squirrel could jump in a tree at the Atlantic Ocean and never touch the ground until they hit the Mississippi River. That's a falsehood. I was taught wrong. That is not correct. Rather, the South was a mosaic of true prairie, tall grass prairie, and savanna. Our woodlands were originally more savanna-like, far more open than what we think of as woodland today. They were not dense and thick and choked like our woodlands of today. And two different types of wetlands, a savanna-type wetland or a wooded wetland and grassed wetlands. So that was the mosaic of the South. And every region in North America has its own historical ecological perspective. So once we start to realize that, then we now start to understand the potential for what it, again, can be. And this is a recreation of a southeastern savanna. Now, these trees are young, so they don't even come close to rivaling the size, the massive size of the trees that used to exist. But it was very open like this. The early explorers and pioneers that moved from the Atlantic states into the states of Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Arkansas could easily navigate their wagon trains through these savannas, these wooded areas. They were that open. Now, this is at one of our clients' ranches near Cimarron, New Mexico, and I just want you to notice the species that are all together, okay? So again, I'm going to play this video, count the number of species that are together. This was not contrived. This was not purposefully done. These species did this all on their own. So what do you see there? What did you see? How many species did you count? What did you see? There were elk. What else? Antelope, pronghorns. What else? Mule deer and white-tailed deer. 4 different ruminant species traveling together. Now, what keystone species is missing, though? The bison. The bison, okay? But our client is a ranch. They have cattle. The cattle are the proxy for the bison. But my point here, folks, is that our perception often is that the bison and all these different species traveled separately. That is not true at all. Rather, if you went back 500 or more years ago on this continent and you viewed the scenes, it would have been much more like the Serengeti, where you saw this incredible array of different species all moving together, all intersected. That's what it used to be like. And we also see lots of bird species returning, especially ground nesting birds. We wrote Audubon Conservation Ranching and Bird Friendly Certification Program for them, and they adopted grazing when they once were vehemently opposed to grazing. But they have now adopted it and embraced it and now promote it because they know if you graze properly, then it restores rather than destroys ground nesting bird habitat. So by using regenerative grazing, what we call adaptive grazing, we've been very successful in many regions of the country in restoring quail habitat, prairie chicken, grouse, and so on and so forth. So again, quail habitat, and we're seeing this just explode. You don't have to purposefully build this. Regenerative grazing builds this for you. It creates the nesting and brooding and food and other habitat that these birds need to survive and thrive. Now, I'm going to go through these very quickly, but there are 6 soil health principles. And they are, number 1, context. Context. And this is the most important principle. If you don't first define your context, then you have no clue how to properly apply the other 5 principles. So the next one is minimize soil disturbance, and that's in every way. Minimize or eliminate tillage, chemical application, synthetic fertilizer, so on and so forth. Keep the soil covered or armored year-round. Increase diversity, and this is not just increased diversity in plant species, but in insects, soil microbes, and all other forms of life. Living roots in the soil year-round. This is actually far easier to achieve than you may imagine. We are now seeing living roots in the soil year-round up in Canada. Even we're doing work even as far north as the Northwest Territories, and we are seeing living roots in the soil year-round, even that far north. So don't say you can't do this. Absolutely, and down here in the South, we have zero excuse for this one. We should absolutely have living roots in the soil year-round. And then integration of livestock. This is one that many farmers have abandoned, but yet it's absolutely critical to having full ecological health. You absolutely cannot have that in the absence of grazing, browsing, foraging animals. It's impossible. So then the 4 ecosystem processes. These are the water cycle, the mineral cycle, the energy cycle, and community dynamics. So what we're doing is we're taking those 6 principles of soil health and we're applying those to be able to optimize the 4 ecosystem processes. And once we do that, we have thriving farms, and not just thriving from a biodiversity and an ecological standpoint, but also thriving from a productivity and a net profitability standpoint. So this matters, and it matters a lot. And we need to protect our soil always. Here's why. I took this picture last year in May in Mississippi. This was at the time a brand new client for us, and they were set stock grazers, and that's what you're seeing here, the results of set stock grazing. They had grazed down certain areas of the pastures really tight and then left tufts of grass in other areas. The air temperature was 85 degrees that day, but where the cattle had grazed down tight, the soil temperature was 109 degrees. But yet over where they had left this tuft of grass, just literally 1 pace away, the soil temperature was only 78 degrees. Now, where do you think the 4 ecosystem processes were thriving, and where were they impaired? It's easy. Where the soil was 109 degrees, we had nothing going on. Okay? The 4 ecosystem processes were stopped dead in their tracks. But just a pace away, where they left some grass, we had all 4 ecosystem processes still working for us. So that's how critical this is. And then we work with a lot of dairy producers as well, and this is on some Michigan dairies that we're working with. This is the guy in the yellow t-shirt is the owner of this dairy. It's an 8,000 cow dairy. And the guy in the gray shirt is Kent Solberg. He's one of our consultants at Understanding Ag. And so this was the first cover crop this dairy farmer had ever planted in his life. Been dairy farming his entire life, never planted a cover crop. Okay? So this was the very first time he had done this, and he was in the learning process. But as you'll look here, you'll see that right where they're standing, it was close to the road, and you'll see that the cover crop is growing denser and thicker right there, right? That's because of water draining off the road from rainfall and running right through that area. So it was more well watered than the rest of this field. Now this was in August up in Michigan, and part of the fields were up on knolls and ridges, and the cover crop didn't do nearly as well because they were exceedingly dry. This was last year, and they were very, very dry, okay, and hot, or what they call hot, not what we call hot down here, but what they call hot in Michigan. So the air temperature was 89 degrees. You know, we consider that a nice balmy summer day if we're just 89, but they're sweating and huffing and puffing at 89. But if you'll look across this field, take a look at what's happening with soil temperatures, depending on the degree of cover and shading on the soil surface. So as you look across where Gert and Kent are standing, because we have greater density of cover crop growth, more shading on the soil surface, the temperature is only 79 degrees. But if you look out where it was more bare, it was 118 degrees. Now look at the mown ditch. That would simulate a freshly mown hay field, okay? So for all of us that cut and rake and bale hay, folks, take a look at this, pay attention to this. Where that ditch was mown, what was the temperature? 117 degrees. Okay? Now look over where they couldn't mow because there were trees there in that ditch. It was only 72 degrees. Now look at the surface temperature of the blacktop, the road. 118 degrees. Folks, what are we doing? What are we doing? Okay? We've got to pay attention to this because everywhere that you see temperatures of 100 degrees or more on the soil, we have just totally shut down all of our biological functions in our water cycle. We've just shut them down. So this is also what happens. This was in their cornfields, center pivot irrigated cornfields. This was in July, so the corn was way up and canopied and all of that. But what do you see here in that bed in the upper left? What are you seeing there in that bed of soil that we just dug up? You're seeing salts, okay? You see all that white stuff, and then you see over on the upper right, you see all that white stuff on the top of the soil. They cannot infiltrate rainfall or irrigation water because of the incredibly poor biology and the lack of soil aggregate. And so they're getting rapid evaporation of the water leaving behind all these salts. So they're slowly but surely salinating their fields, their crop fields that they depend on to feed their dairy cows. And then look at this. It's actually cracking and peeling on the soil surface. All of these are signs of an incredibly unhealthy soil, yet this dairy farmer, until that day, never thought that. He thought because he applied copious amounts of dairy manure to his fields every year, all the time, every acre, plus synthetic fertilizers, that he was creating very healthy soil, vibrant, living soil, when actually all he was doing was slowly and steadily killing all the life in his soil. And that's what was occurring. I love this quote by Albert Einstein: "No problem can be solved by the same consciousness that created it." Now, this doesn't mean that the same person cannot solve a problem they created. It just means they can't solve it by thinking the same way. They have to change the way they think to be able to solve the problem. So let's jump into adaptive grazing, what we define as adaptive grazing. First of all, it's a form of grazing that allows us to be fully adaptable and flexible to ever-changing conditions. It produces the greatest results in the shortest period of time. We've been doing this for 3 decades now, and we have clients that have been doing it for more than 5 in different countries around the world, and so far nobody has ever hit a threshold. So if we're doing this right, we don't even know where the threshold is. We don't know where the ceiling is. Even if there is a ceiling, is there? I'm beginning to doubt that there is, to be honest with you. It allows you to produce continuous incremental progress and achieve the highest levels of net profitability. And here are the keys to it. It's goal-oriented. It's predicated on stock density, or pounds of livestock per acre, not stocking rate or head per acre or acres per head. Management and flexibility are key, as are frequent movement and rest. We're going to talk about that. And one of our targets is plant root system recovery. I want to talk about that on our pasture walk when we go out in the fields. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do we know that we have root system recovery, not just above ground shoot biomass recovery, but plant root system recovery? How do we know that? How do we know we're achieving that? And it's highly reliant in many areas of the world on temporary fencing technology. However, it is not totally dependent on temporary fencing technology. Now, we use that all the time on our own farms, and I love it. And luckily today we have outstanding temporary fencing technology, and it gets better every year. But we have many clients, because some of our clients have ranches that are 500,000 to 1 million or more acres in some very rugged landscapes. In the western U.S., Canada, Mexico, and other areas, we're using herding and placement, daily herding and placement, which is very, very easy to do. The livestock train up very quickly to this, and you don't need any fencing at all. And they learn to basically graze where they're placed every day. So we're able to successfully use that. Now, our goal and objective here is to restore a completely functional carbon cycle and to simulate nature. How did nature build the incredible fertility and biology that the early pioneers moving across North America experienced? We want to simulate that. And we do this through biomimicry and ecomimicry. We no longer have the very large herds of roaming wild ruminants across North America, and we never will again, because we've got roads and interstates and fences and cities and towns and so on and so forth. So we have to now use our domesticated livestock as a proxy to do it for us. And that means that we must be the manager of their movement across that landscape and how they impact that landscape, whether positively or negatively. So what does stock density look like? Well, here's a handful of examples. We got 100,000, 250,000, 500,000, and 1 million pounds per acre. Now pay very close attention to my next statement. We do every one of these stock densities and many more some of the time. We don't do any one of these all of the time. It would be a critical mistake to pick a stock density and say, that's the magic, that's the secret, and I'm sticking with that one stock density from this point forward. Do not do that. But yet, that is what many have done. They may have heard me speak somewhere and mention a stock density, or Greg, or Teddy, or anybody else in here. Oh. Okay? Good. And then think that they heard us just because we mentioned 100,000 pounds per acre or 50,000 or whatever. Oh yeah, that's it. That's where you go wrong. Okay? Do not pick a stock density and hang your hat on that. We also work with a lot of bison ranchers. We have bison in very large herds now, in herds of 3,000 to 5,000 bison trained to move daily under a single strand of poly wire, okay? Bison, and we're doing this routinely. This is a bison herd at the Standing Butte Ranch in Pierce, South Dakota, one of our clients. There's 3,500 head of bison in here, and again, they're moving them every single day under a single strand of poly wire. But we can accomplish high stock density with other species as well. For instance, chickens. Okay, so these are our laying hens. Again, about 8,000 laying hens here that you see. And look at the density that they're creating. And think about the degree of trample in manure and urine application and biological application and stimulation of the soil that these chickens are creating as they move across. We move them every day as well. Now, chickens, if you want a very high degree of trample, by golly, chickens will do it, okay? Cattle and sheep and goats and everything else will still leave some stuff standing, even at the highest densities almost. But chickens, they'll trample pretty much 99% of everything out there. This is a move on our farm in Alabama. This is a herd of about 600 finishers. So these are all finishing steers and heifers. And one of the things that I want you to note here is that as this 600 head moves into the next paddock, look at all the birds. Okay, so we have multiple species of birds that travel with these cattle and our other species of livestock every day to help control flies and other pest insects. And then this is them moving further into the paddock, the same 600 head. And if you pay attention against the skyline there, you'll start to see wood swallows coming out of the trees and starting to swoop down over the tops of the cattle. So again, even on our finishing cattle, we move them multiple times a day under higher stock densities. This is an example of some of the densities that they're grazing under in the finishing process. And this is one of our dairy clients up in Minnesota, and I'm going to show you their move. So they are making a move, from one paddock to the next. So they graze in between their milkings every day. Now, tell me one thing that you note about this dairy herd. What do you see that's unique about a dairy herd? Should be quite obvious. Who's a dairyman in here? What? Say it. Calves? There's calves on the cows. Okay? Why are we separating all our calves from our cows, folks? Do you know that if you raise the calves, these heifer calves, that are the future dairy cows that you're depending on, if you raise them with the herd and grazing every day, you're producing profoundly positive epigenetic effects that are going to pay off handsomely for you from a net profit lifetime. And you're greatly extending their longevity, the number of lactations that they have, and you're greatly reducing their health problems. Everything is positive about this, folks. There's nothing negative about this if you're a dairy producer. These guys are milking just shy of 100 head of dairy cows and making an outstanding living as a family. Moving them every day in between the morning and evening milkings. They're moving them 3 to 4 times a day to fresh paddocks. They love their life. It's super simple, super easy, and their cows are very healthy. They're averaging more than 8.5 lactations per cow. Okay? Did you get that? More than 8.5 lactations per cow. Okay, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. They are the rule of compounding, the rule of diversity, and the rule of disruption. When we go out to the pasture walk, we're going to talk about this a little bit. So let's talk about them separately. Okay, first of all, no matter what species you're grazing, these 3 rules apply. So the rule of compounding. Number 1, there never are any singular effects, ever, ever. Men, how many of you in here are married? Okay. Have you ever forgotten your wife's birthday or your anniversary or anything like that? Yeah, maybe. Okay. Did that ever produce a singular effect? No, sir. That produces a compounding, cascading effect that pretty much lasts the rest of your life. To death do you part. She never forgets the anniversary or birthday you forgot. Okay? You can remember the rest of them for the rest of your life, but she's always going to remind you about the one that you forgot. And how do I know that? Yeah, I made that mistake once. Okay? So there never are any singular effects. And here's the other deal. These compounding, cascading effects are never neutral in nature. They're either positive or negative. It's incumbent upon us to decide that. Our management, the decisions we make or don't make. So make no mistake about it, an unmade decision just produce compounding, cascading effects for you, just as much as a made decision did, okay? So the question we have to ask ourselves on a daily basis is, are we producing positive compounding effects, or are we producing negative compounding effects? That's what we have to ask ourselves every single day in terms of the decisions that we're making and the management that we're applying. And this also applies to epigenetic effects. Epigenetics are never singular, they're always compounding, and they're never neutral, either positive or negative. The second rule, the rule of diversity: nature never produces a monoculture anywhere that nature has control. Instead, nature exerts her influence to produce this incredible abundance and array of diversity in everything from life beneath the soil to life above the soil. We don't see a monoculture in anything at all. So who is the only creature on the face of the earth that creates a monoculture? Us. Why? Why are we doing that? Why do we feel compelled? Why do we believe we must do that? Okay, but we do, don't we? We feel like we must create monocultures, and we do it all the time. So let me ask this question to help you better understand this. How many people in here have been athletes before? Okay, just raise your hand, okay? All right, so, and I wrestled in college, and so I had to go through all of that. So let me ask you, as an athlete, particularly if you want to be an elite athlete, what do you have to do? Do you do the exact same exercise routine at the same intensity and same duration day after day after day after day, year after year to become an elite athlete? No. What do you have to do? You have to alter that exercise routine, don't you? You have to change the duration, the intensity of what you're doing. Why? Because every cell has cellular memory. And if we do the same thing at the same intensity all the time, our bodies and every cell gets used to that, and they say, I've done that before. I don't need to gain resilience or endurance or strength or anything because I'm used to this. So if the only way that we can improve ourselves is through challenging ourselves, okay? And are we biology? Yep. Is everything that we deal with out here biology? Okay? So if that's the case, then if we have to introduce challenges to ourselves to continue to improve, why would we not have to do that out here on our farms and ranches? We do. And by the way, in this diversity, in terms of plant species diversity, we want to see grasses, legumes, forbs, multiple functional group diversity. Why? Because this creates a whole series of positive compounding and cascading effects. And I'll talk a lot more about this when we get out into the pasture walk. And many of these plant functional groups that we call weeds are actually forbs. Do you know that there is no such thing as an objective definition of a weed? The definition of a weed is 100% subjective. What you call a weed is not what I call a weed. Anything that my livestock will eat is not a weed. And everything that we call a weed, if it's growing there, it's growing there for a purpose. It's growing there for a purpose. It is trying to repair damage we caused. So instead of cursing that weed and hating that weed and thinking it's there to irritate and aggravate you, that plant is growing there at that point in time to heal a scar we created. We created. So anytime you have a weed problem, or you believe you do not point your finger anywhere else. Do not point it outward, point it inward. We were the creator of that. We were the cause of that, but we can also, through our management, be the solution to that. So we have to ask ourselves, whatever we're seeing growing out there, what is nature trying to tell me? And what we have to understand, diversity again is the key. Well, this is, I have been carefully documenting at our farm in Uniontown, Alabama, BDA Farm. I've been very carefully documenting the diversity of plant species that we have. And to date, I have documented now more than 140 different plant species growing in our pastures, more than 140. And we planted none of them. Okay? Now, some of these you see up there are tame, what we call tame grass species, but we didn't plant them. Some prior owner planted them. We planted nothing. Many of these that you see are native species. Okay? They are native species. So they're growing in abundance here. So, and we're increasing every year. Our goal is to get up to over 200 different plant species growing here. And we have documented our livestock eating every one of these. There is not any of these they will not eat. Okay? So we manage for diversity, and we don't sweat what many people call the weeds. We don't even pay them any attention at all. They're no problem to us whatsoever. And through the work of Dr. Fred Provenza, we now know that landscapes with diverse arrays of plants are actually nutrition centers, pharmaceutical centers for our livestock. They contain vast arrays of phytonutrients, phytochemicals that are medicinal and anti-parasitic in nature for our livestock. So if we have greater diversity in the plant species that are growing out there, that's a food source for both the life beneath the soil and all the life above the soil. And we also know that the health of our livestock improves dramatically when we have greater diversity out there. How many of you have ever done stocker production, stocker cattle production, okay? What's one of the primary issues that stocker operators experience? Health issues, morbidity, mortality, right? Okay. Well, what are most of them grazing? Monoculture and low diversity pastures. Well, no wonder they're having morbidity and mortality, because they don't have the living pharmacy out there for them, because they lack diversity in the plant species. And you cannot fertilize that in, okay? You cannot fertilize it in. You've got to manage it in. Russian olive, this is a plant species that many thought, livestock will never eat that. Well, look at this. Turn them in, 4 hours later, they stripped every leaf off the Russian olive. Now, this is a video that we shot on our farm down in the Black Belt Prairie. We can have a lot of ash and honey locusts and all of that wanting to grow there. And so we control them through our livestock. So this is a video that we shot with turning in livestock under ultra-high density into a big ash patch. Now, from the ground level, we did a lot of drone footage here, but from the ground level, we also shot it from that view. When you first turn them in, this was so dense and thick, they disappeared. It was almost Jurassic-like, but they just disappeared into it. So take a look at this. So we turned them in. We had about 1 million pounds per acre stock density here, and we turned them in to this big ash patch to gain control. And yes, they're eating a lot of the leaves off the ash trees. And that's a honey locust there. So there you go. You could see all through it very, very easily. That took 30 minutes. 30 minutes. And that was all it took of our time to be able to totally change that landscape. So livestock producers are finding that morbidity and mortality decreases significantly when we have greater diversity of plant species out there that we're grazing. Now, the last rule, the rule of disruption. Nature has tremendous resilience and responds well to challenges, okay? So because of that, we now know we can introduce these planned, purposeful disruptions, just like with our exercise routine. And if we do that, that creates a whole host of positive compounding effects. So number one, flexibility is the key. Where we go wrong is when we try to turn regenerative and adaptive into a prescription, a formula, a recipe. Just give me the steps. That's the worst thing I could ever do for you. If you ask me that, just give me the steps and I'll just follow your formula. I'm not going to do that because I would be doing you a disservice. Okay? You've got to implement regenerative and adaptive within your context on your farm under your management. I cannot do that for you. You have to do it for yourself. So every time that we try to do something from a formulaic or prescriptive approach, we may make progress initially because we have changed something. We introduced a disruption. But over just a few short years, you're going to hit a wall and wonder why. You stop making progress and you wonder why. Well, you quit making progress because you made it a formula, you made it a recipe. It was no longer regenerative and adaptive. And unfortunately, most of the peer-reviewed research that I read out there, where the researchers are talking about they compared regenerative or adaptive to conventional or whatever, no, heck, they didn't. What they're calling regenerative and adaptive is not that at all. They turned that into a prescription and did the same thing over and over again. So they had an incorrect definition of those terms in their research. That doesn't work, folks. That doesn't work. That's not sound science. Okay? It's not sound science. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we be disruptive? All right, so here's several ways that we can be disruptive. Alter stock densities. Remember what I said early on? Do not pick a stock density. Alter stock densities. I call this pulsing of stock densities. Don't move through the same rotation patterns year after year. If your pastures are named A, B, C, D, and E, and every spring you start in A and then move to B, C, D, and E, and the next year A, B, C, D, and E, and so forth, quit it. Okay? Next year, start at D. This makes a profound difference because of cellular memory in every organism out there, starting with the microbes beneath the soil to the plants, to every organism, to your livestock themselves. You are disrupting their cellular memory. So alter your rotation patterns, alter grazing heights on and off. This is why MIG grazing always hits a wall. You always hit a wall with MIG grazing. Always. Because there's very little alteration of grazing heights on and off and very little alteration of rest periods. That's a mistake. That's a core critical mistake. Alter rest periods. You'll be amazed at how much progress you make when you give certain pastures in alternating years significantly longer rest periods. If you're like us and you do multi-species, alter species order from time to time. Don't run them through in the same order in the same paddocks. Alter time or season of year that you're moving through your paddocks. Alter paddock configuration. As simple as that may seem, it makes a profoundly different result. The shape of the paddock impacts, even under the same stock density, impacts the trample effect, the fertility effect, the biological stimulation effect. So even the shape of the paddock matters, and even planned burns can be a part of this as a disruption. Just don't do any of these on any given acre year after year after year, because now it's no longer a disruption. It is a recipe, it is a prescription, it is a formula. Okay? So I'm going to stop with this one and open it up for questions. And we're going to do this out on the pasture walk. But what is the very best tool in your toolbox? Observation. Observation. Okay? And learn to use all of your senses, the sense of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. Observe the soil, the plants, insects, birds, livestock. Why? Because keen observation develops sound intuition. And if you have sound intuition, you will make far, far better decisions on a daily basis. All right, questions?
I got a question. I've noticed my cows, there's a lot of species other than grasses they prefer, especially the older cows prefer plantain and pigweed, and that seems to help them. But I've got issues with some plants I've never dealt with in the past, like Perella mint. Mm-hmm. Nobody eat it, it's deadly. And I'm not big into just wholesale spraying because it's a bad habit and keeps you from observing what you're doing. But my main issue is Microstygium, Nepalese brown top. and it comprises about 25% of my pasture. Nothing will eat it unless it's an accident. I have no idea how to get rid of it. Even if I burn it off, it comes back. And I'm open to there's some weeds that are beneficial and are part of a diversity system, but some weeds are just noxious. And I'm interested in what you know about Nepalese brown top.
Yeah, so again, let's be a little careful when we say there's some weeds that are just pure 100% noxious, because that's not true, okay? Even though we may view them that way. They're there for a purpose. Parliament, whatever you want to talk about, they're all there for a purpose. Now, and again, this is where we have to look at ourselves and our own management, and that includes me too. I'm talking about myself here, because I've had problems, in different years with different things, but it's always back on us. Nature didn't do that to you or to me. We created the opportunity for what we may term noxious to grow there and to be dominant there. So that means that if we are still exerting the same management there, we're not going to change that. Okay? So we have to think about, what can we alter there? Is there a time of year in those areas that I can go in under significantly higher stock density where I'm not going to have to worry about the toxic impact of that plant and be able to get a high degree of trample, biological stimulation, latent seed bank stimulation and germination, and those types of things. So that's one of the strategies, and that could even include bale grazing in the off-season over top of some of those problem areas. That's one of the things that we have used very strategically and we've been quite successful with, to be able to greatly diminish these noxious areas or areas that are just totally dominated by something, and to be able to get a lot of other plants. The key here, that's always in your seed bank. You're never going to spray it out. You're never going to get it out of the seed bank. So what do you have to do? You have to outcompete it. You have to outcompete it. So we've got to look at strategies and different times of year to do that. Now, if you do have some of these, but there's enough diversity in the total mix, like Parliament or whatever, they have to eat enough of it, okay, to have detrimental effects. So if it's growing in a much broader mix, then most of the time your livestock can take a few bites here and there and you not have any detrimental effects whatsoever. But again, you got to be cognizant of what you're doing and very careful so that you do not create sickness and death in those livestock. But so look at time of year. Look at what kind of impact. Is there a time of year that I can either go in much higher density to stimulate that latent seed bank without bale grazing, or is there a time of year that I can strategically bale graze to control that? Yes?
When you say bale graze, you mean like rolling out bales and basically covering that area?
I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow in my session tomorrow. But no, we typically are not unrolling. We are putting them out as intact bales, and that's purposeful. And I'll show that tomorrow, examples of it, and why we do it with intact bales and the impact that we're achieving with that. Yes, sir.
Anybody else? Oh.
You mentioned earlier about the multi-species grazies, how you could take out the guard dogs. So if you have a multi-species herd, the cows will protect the sheep, and you don't need a guard dog. Did I get that?
Typically, if the sheep are with the cattle, we have virtually no problem, because our coyotes, which are going to be our principal predator for our sheep, virtually nothing else is going to bother the sheep other than the coyotes, in at least in our part of the world. So if they're with the cattle, the coyotes never bother our cattle. So if the sheep are in with the cattle, they don't have any problem. And they are every species that we have is also a tool. They're a revenue generator, but they're also a tool for us for soil building, land building, ecosystem building. So sometimes we have species together. Sometimes they're separate because we have different jobs we want them to do. So we never constrain ourselves by thinking that our sheep or our goats or whatever always have to be with the cattle and never run separately. You know, again, they're a tool, so I'm going to split them when I need to use them as a tool, and then put them together when we need to use them as a tool as well.
Okay, if we have any more questions, if you would keep those for our afternoon session, and we'll get started with our next speaker.